I stood motionless in the dark of my study. My hand gripped the doorknob. Emily's voice came through the crack. Every word was a dagger to my chest. "I do not know, Sarah," she said. "It is just Mark's behavior has become extremely predictable. All work, no play. My wife's laughter once was music to my ears. Now, grades are like nails on a chalkboard. I should have walked away. I should have made my presence known. But curiosity or masochism kept me on the spot." Sarah's voice joined in. "Well, honey, that is what happens after many years of marriage. The spark fades." "Not with James," Emily said, her voice lowering to a conspiratorial whisper. "God, Sarah, he makes me feel alive again, young, desirable." The world tipped on its axis. James, her coworker, with whom she had been working late so often lately, how long was this going on? "Are you planning to leave, Mark?" Sarah asked. There was a pause, and I held my breath while waiting for Emily's response. I do not know," she finally spoke. "No, Mark is stable, reliable, but James, he is exciting, passionate. I wish I had both." I had heard enough. Silently, I shut the study door and sank into my leather chair. The room suddenly seemed too small. The air was too thick. I loosened my tie and tried to breathe. Emily's words echoed in my head. Predictable, stable, reliable. When did these become insults? When did I become the boring husband she needed to get away from? I'm not sure how long I sat there, staring at nothing, my mind replaying every moment of our marriage, looking for the cracks. The clock on the wall was ticking away minutes, then hours. It was after midnight when I finally stood. My decision is made. If Emily wanted excitement, I'd give her some, only on my terms. The next morning, I awoke earlier than usual, showered, and prepared coffee. Emily came down just as I was pouring the second cup. "Morning, honey," she said, as she kissed my cheek. "You're awake early." I handed her the coffee. I couldn't sleep with so much on my mind. She raised her eyebrow. "Oh, trouble at work?" "Nope, nothing like that." I took a sip of my coffee and watched her over the rim. "Actually, I've been thinking of us." Emily froze for a brief moment before recovering. "What about us?" I sat down my mug and leaned against the counter, adopting a casual posture. "Well, we have been together for what, 15 years now?" She nodded slowly. "The best 15 years of my life." "Liar," I smiled, hoping it did not appear as forced as it felt. "They've been wonderful, but I can't help but wonder if we're stuck in a rut." Emily's eyes widened slightly. "A rut? What do you mean?" "You know, same old routine. Work, dinner, television, bed, rinse, repeat." I shrugged. I was thinking maybe we should shake things up a little. She sat down her coffee and gave me her full attention. "What did you have in mind?" It was finally time for action. I took a deep breath. "So, I was thinking, what if we open up our marriage?" Emily's shocked expression was almost comical. If I hadn't been so concerned with maintaining my composure, I might have laughed. "Open our marriage," she repeated, her voice higher than usual. "You mean to see people?" I nodded and kept my expression neutral. "Yeah, do some exploring, meet new people, have fun." Emily stared at me for a long time, and I could almost see the wheels turning in her mind. Slowly, a smile spread across her face. "Mark, I don't know what to say. I never imagined you would be open to something like this," she said. I shrugged again, playing it cool. Life is too short to always play it safe, right? She practically threw herself at me, wrapping her arms around my throat. "Oh, Mark, I thought I was the only one who felt restless here. This is amazing." I hugged her back, resisting the urge to push her away. "So, you're on board then?" Emily drew back, her eyes shining. "Absolutely, oh. This will be so much fun. We should, however, establish some ground rules to ensure fairness, of course." I replied, "I'm already planning my next move. Why don't we talk about it over dinner tonight?" She nodded enthusiastically, her perfect smile broader than ever. "I can't wait to tell Soar. I can't wait to begin this new chapter with you." I watched as she practically bounced out of the kitchen, undoubtedly to call her lover and tell him the good news. As soon as she left, I removed the mask. My hands clenched into fists at my sides. The game was on. The rest of the day was a blur. I went through the motions at work. My thoughts kept returning to Emily and her betrayal. By the time I got home, I had made a plan. Emily was already there, humming while setting the table. She had prepared my favorite meal, steak and roasted potatoes. The irony was not lost on me. She said, "Welcome home, darling," and kissed me for too long. "Dinner is almost ready." I loosened my tie and poured myself a glass of wine. "It smells great. Special occasion?" She giggled. "So, are we celebrating our new arrangement?" We sat down to eat, and Emily could not stop smiling. It made my stomach turn. So, between bites, she mentioned those ground rules. I nodded and took a sip of wine. "Right. What did you have in mind?" "Well, I believe we should be honest with one another. There will be no sneaking around or lying about our destination or who we are with." I nearly choked on my wine. This woman has audacity. "That sounds reasonable," I said. "Anything else?" Emily thought for a moment. "Perhaps we should set a limit on how frequently we see others, and no bringing them into our home." I agreed. "What about protection?" She flushed slightly. "Oh, of course. Always, we need to stay safe." I nodded and pushed my half-eaten steak around my plate. Do you have anyone in mind already?" Emily's blush deepened. "Well, James is at work. We've been flirting for a long time, but I never considered now that we are open." I forced a smile. "Go for it. Life is too short. Remember?" She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "You are the best, Mark. I'm extremely lucky to have you." I squeezed back, probably more forcefully than necessary. "I am the lucky one." After dinner, Emily excused herself to make a call. I didn't have to guess who she was calling. I retreated to my study, closing the door behind me. Once alone, I took a shaky breath. The weight of what I was about to do rested on my shoulders, but there was no going back now. I picked up the phone and dialed a familiar number. "Alex, it's Mark. I need your help with something delicate." My lawyer and longtime friend listened as I described the situation. To his credit, he did not interrupt. When I finished, there was a prolonged pause. "That's something, Mark?" he finally asked. "Once you start on this path," my voice, her heart, she made her decision. "Now, I'm making mine." Alex sighed. "All right, I'll begin gathering what we need. But Mark, take care. Avoid doing anything that cannot be undone." I hung up, staring at the phone in my hand. Careful. It was too late to be careful. Emily had shattered our lives together, and I was going to pick up the pieces on my own terms. I sat in the darkened study. I could hear Emily laughing on the phone in our bedroom. My wife was planning a date with her lover, and thought she had everything figured out. Little did she know that her perfect plan was about to fail, and I'd be there to witness the devastation. The doorbell rang, interrupting my thoughts. Emily's excited footsteps hurried down the stairs. "Chloe," Emily's voice rang out, filled with warmth and affection. "I am so glad you were able to make it." I emerged from my study with a smile on my face as I watched Emily embrace her younger sister. Chloe, a vision in her mid-20s, returned the hug with enthusiasm. Of course, I wouldn't pass up the opportunity to visit my favorite sister. Chloe laughed, her eyes bright. Emily rolled her eyes. "I'm your only sister, you goofball." As they separated, Chloe's gaze focused on me. "Mark, it's wonderful to see you." I stepped forward, hugging her for just a second longer than usual. "Chloe, it's always a pleasure. How long has it been?" "Too long," she responded, her smile widening. "You all look great. Your married life must be going well." I caught Emily's gaze over Chloe's shoulder, noticing my wife's smile falter for a brief moment. "Oh, it has ups and downs," I spoke lightly. "But do we make it work, honey?" Emily nodded, recovering quickly. "Of course. Why don't we move this into the living room? I'll get some wine." Emily disappeared into the kitchen, and I guided Chloe to the couch, sitting so close that our knees almost touched. "So how's life in the big city treating you?" Chloe began, launching into an animated description of her job and social life. Her hands moved expressively as she spoke. I listened carefully, nodding and laughing at the appropriate times. When Emily returned with the wine, I noticed her eyebrows raised slightly in response to our proximity. "Here we go," Emily said, setting down her glasses. "Chloe, I hope red is fine." "Perfect," Chloe replied, taking a sip. "Oh, that's good. You always had great taste." I raised a glass to family visits and good wine. As we clinked glasses, I allowed my fingers to brush against Chloe's, holding her gaze for a little longer than necessary. A faint blush rose to her cheeks. The evening progressed with lots of laughter and stories. I focused my attention on Chloe, asking about her life, dreams, and disappointments. Emily interjected occasionally, but I could see confusion and slight annoyance in her eyes. "You know," I said during a pause in the conversation, "we should go out tomorrow, Chloe. I could show you around town and maybe grab lunch." "Emily has plans." "Do not dare," Emily blinked, caught off guard. "Oh, yes, work thing, but you two should absolutely go out. Chloe, you'd enjoy the new cafe downtown." Chloe's eyes lit up. "That sounded great. Don't you mind, Emily?" "Not at all," Emily said. Her smile did not quite reach her eyes. "You two have fun." As the night went on, Emily excused herself to bed, claiming an early start. I stayed awake with Chloe, our conversation becoming more intimate as the wine flowed. "You know," I admitted, leaning in conspiratorially, "Emily and I have been discussing ways to open up our marriage." Chloe's eyes widened. "Really? Wow. How does this work?" I shrugged and traced the rim of my wine glass. "We're still figuring it out, but the goal is to explore. You know, life is too short to limit yourself." Chloe nodded slowly, her gaze moving to my lips before returning to my eyes. "That is interesting. That's very modern of you," I added with a wink. "Anyway, it is getting late. We should both get some sleep if we plan to explore the town tomorrow." As I led Chloe to the guest room, I rested my hand on the small of her back. "Good night, Chloe. Sweet dreams." She looked up at me, her gaze searching mine. "Good night, Mark. Thank you for everything." Before heading to my own bedroom, I watched her disappear into the room. Emily was already asleep, or pretending to be. I slipped into bed, my mind racing with plans for the coming days. The next morning, I awoke early, showering and dressing carefully. I found Chloe in the kitchen, dressed fresh and lovely in a sundress. "Good morning," I said, admiring her form. "Sleep well, Chloe?" "Like a baby." She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear and smiled shyly. "Are we ready for our day out?" "Absolutely. Let me leave a note for Emily." I scribbled a quick message, deliberately vague about our plans, and placed it on the counter before offering my arm to Chloe. We set out, and the day was full of activity. I took Chloe to all of my favorite spots in town, sharing stories and inside jokes. We lingered over lunch at a cozy bistro, with our chairs getting closer as the meal progressed. "I have to say," Chloe said as we walked through the park later, "I'm having a wonderful time. It's good to see this side of you, Mark." I stopped, turning to face her. "Which side is that?" She bit her lip and looked up at me through her lashes. "The fun part, the spontaneous side. I always assumed you were Emily's serious husband." I chuckled and stepped closer. "Chloe, there is a lot about me that you don't know." The air between us crackled with tension. For a brief moment, I thought she might kiss me, but then she took a step back and cleared her throat. "We should probably go back. Emily will wonder where we are." I nodded, hiding my disappointment, of course. "But we should do it again someday." As we drove home, I could feel Chloe sneaking glances at me. A seed had been planted. Now all it needed was time to grow. Emily was back at home, waiting. Her face was a mask of forced cheerfulness. "There you are," she said. I was beginning to worry. Chloe launched into an enthusiastic recap while watching Emily's reactions. I noticed her jaw tightening and her eyes narrowing slightly. She was jealous. Over the next few days, I kept up my careful dance, always testing the boundaries of propriety but never quite crossing the line. Emily, meanwhile, became increasingly agitated. One night, as we were getting ready for bed, she snapped, "What's going on between you and Chloe?" I glanced up from my book, The Picture of Innocence. "What do you mean, Emily?" Emily paced around the room, gesticulating wildly. "Mark, don't play dumb. Flirting, secret glances, and outings. Do you sleep with my sister? I set my book aside and fixed a steady gaze on her. No, I am not sleeping with Chloe. But what if I was? Isn't it the purpose of our new arrangement to investigate? She flinched as if I had slapped her. But she is my sister, and James is my wife's co-worker, I countered. Are there any rules about who we can and cannot see? Emily opened her mouth before closing it again. She sank onto the bed, her rage subsiding. I didn't expect it to be like this. I moved to sit next to her, close but not touching. Like what, Emily? Be open, honest. Isn't this what you wanted? She looked at me, tears welling in her eyes. I'm not sure what I want anymore, Mark. This is not how I expected it to be. I stood up and looked down at her. You made your decision, Emily. You must now accept this reality without another word. I left the room, leaving her to cry and regret. I had work to do the following day. I met Chloe for coffee. She appeared nervous, fidgeting with her cup. Mark, I think we should talk about what's going on between us, she said. I reached across the table to take her hand. Chloe, what do you want to happen? She bit her lip, her eyes met mine. I believe I'm falling for you, Mark, but you are still married to my sister. It's complicated. I squeezed her hand. Life is complicated, but sometimes we have to get what we want. Chloe's breath caught. So, what do you want, Mark? I leaned in, keeping my voice low. You, Chloe. I want you. We kissed, and I knew I had her completely. Meanwhile, Emily was in a downward spiral. She called me repeatedly and left frantic voicemails. Mark, please, we need to talk. I made an error, Owen. Things with James just came home. I deleted every message without responding. James cornered Emily in the office break room. His eyes filled with rage. I'm tired of being Emily's dirty little secret, he hissed. It's time you left your husband. Emily paled. James, I can't simply leave Mark. We live a life together. James slammed his hand against the counter, making Emily jump. A life? Do you mean his money? Is that all you care about? That isn't fair. Emily protested weakly. James leaned in, keeping his voice low. Fair? I will tell you what isn't fair. I'm putting everything on the line for you while you play house with your wealthy husband, Emily. The time has come to make your decision. Emily's gaze darted around the room, searching for an exit. I need time to think, she said. James grabbed her arm. You are out of time. Make your choice now, or I'll walk. Emily felt tears well up in her eyes. Please, James, do not do this. He released her arm, disgust visible on his face. You're pathetic, Emily. You do not deserve either of us. James stormed away, leaving Emily trembling and alone. That evening, I arranged a chance meeting between Emily and me at our favorite restaurant. When I approached her table, she was eating by herself, picking at her salad. Mind if I join you? I asked, my tone neutral. Emily's head snapped up, hope flashing in her eyes. Mark, of course, please sit, she replied. I sat in the chair across from her, studying her face. She seemed tired, worn. How are you doing, Emily? I asked in a casual tone. She forced a smile. I'm okay, Mark. I'm so glad you're here. We really should talk. I raised an eyebrow. Oh, what about? Emily leaned forwards, her voice urgent. About us, about our marriage. Mark, I have made a terrible mistake. I want to make things right between us. I took a sip of water and let the silence stretch. So, what about James? Emily flinched as if I had hit her. How did you know? I smiled coldly. I know everything, Emily. I've known from the beginning. Her face lost its color. Mark, I can explain. I put up my hand, cutting her off. There's no need. I understand completely. You wanted excitement and passion, things you felt were missing from our marriage. It isn't like that, Emily, she protested weakly. I leaned back in my seat, my gaze never leaving hers. Is not it? Well, it doesn't matter anymore, Emily. You got exactly what you wanted, freedom to explore, to discover yourself. Tears streamed down her face. But I don't want that anymore. I want you, Mark, only you. I stood and tossed my napkin on the table. Too little, too late, Emily. Enjoy your freedom, I said as I walked away. I could hear her soft sobbing, but I did not look back. Later that night, Chloe and I met in a hotel room across town. She was waiting for me, a vision in black lace. "Are you sure about this, Mark?" she asked as I approached. I pulled her close, my lips finding hers in a searing kiss. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," I said as we fell onto the bed. I pushed all thoughts of Emily from my mind. This was my new beginning, my revenge, and it was sweet. I was in my study when I heard the front door slam. Emily's frantic footsteps echoed through the house. "Mark!" she shouted. "Mark, where are you?" I took a deep breath, steeling myself for the confrontation. "In here, Emily!" She burst into the room, her face flushed and her eyes welled up with tears. "We need to talk now." I leaned back in my chair and folded my hands on the desk. "So, talk, Emily." She paced the room, her hands twisted together. "The open marriage thing, it is not working. We need to put an end to it, return to how things were." I raised an eyebrow. "Oh, and why is that?" She came to a stop and turned to face me. "I love you, Mark. Only you. I made a mistake with James, but the situation is now resolved. I want us to be ourselves again." I stood and slowly walked around the desk to face her. "What if I don't want that, Emily?" I asked. "What if I enjoy my freedom?" Emily's face wrinkled. "What do you mean, Mark?" she pleaded. "I mean," I said, my voice strained, "that I'm not interested in returning to our old life." Emily reached for me, but I moved back. "Mark, I will do anything. Please give me another chance." I shook my head. "There are no more chances, Emily. You've made your choice." Is there anyone else?" she whispered. I met her gaze, allowing her to see the truth in my eyes. "Yes, Emily." She stumbled backward as if I had struck her. "Whom do I know?" Her voice trembled. "You could say that," I replied, a cold smile spreading across my lips. "It's Chloe." Emily's face lost its color. "Chloe? My sister? Are you sleeping with my sister?" I shrugged. "Did you want an open marriage?" I asked. I complied, I added. Emily's shock turned into fury. "You bastard! How could you do this to me?" "To us?" she exclaimed. I laughed bitterly. "There hasn't been any between us since you began sleeping with James behind my back." She flinched at my words. "That was different. I made an error." "No, Emily," I said with a low voice. "A mistake is forgetting to purchase milk. What you did was a choice, and you are now dealing with the consequences." Emily's legs gave out, and she collapsed to the floor. Sobs racked her body. "What are we planning to do?" she asked. I walked past her and toward the door. "We are going to get divorced. I recommend you contact a lawyer," I said as I exited the room. I heard her broken whisper, "Mark, please. I love you." But I did not look back. The following day, I received a call from Chloe. Her voice was tight and angry. "How could you, Mark? How could you exploit me like this?" I sighed and pinched the bridge of my nose. "Chloe, it's not as you think." "Oh, seriously?" she snapped. "Because from where I'm standing, it appears that you used me to get back at my sister. Was any of this real?" I paused, choosing my words carefully. "What began as vengeance turned into something more, Chloe. My feelings for you are real." There was a prolonged pause. "I need time to think, Mark. Do not call me." The line went dead. I stared at the phone with a hollow feeling in my chest. I hadn't expected this complication, but I couldn't let it ruin my plans. I'd come too far to turn back now. Later that evening, I got a text from an unknown number. "We need to talk. Meet me at the Riverside Cafe tomorrow at noon. Come alone." James wanted to play hardball. Fine with me. The next day, I arrived early at the cafe and chose a table with a good view of the entrance. James walked in at precisely noon. His face was hard-lined. He slid into the seat across from me. "Thank you for coming." I nodded, my expression impassive. "What do you want, James?" He leaned forward, keeping his voice low. "I want you to offer Emily a fair divorce settlement, half of everything. If you don't, I will make public your affair with Chloe." I couldn't help it. I laughed, and James's face flushed with rage. "Do you think this is funny?" he snarled. I composed myself and fixed him with a cold stare. I think it's hilarious that you believe you have any leverage in this situation. James blinked, confusion supplanting anger. What do you mean? I leaned in, my voice barely above a whisper. I mean, James, I know everything, including every dirty little secret, lie, and betrayal. I've got proof of your affair with Emily, proof that you attempted to manipulate her for financial gain. Hell, I even have evidence of the little embezzlement scheme you've been running at work. James's face lost its color. How did you do it? It doesn't matter how. I cut him off. What matters is that if you attempt to blackmail me, I will bury you. You will lose your job, reputation, and everything. Is this what you want? James slumped into his seat, defeated. What do you want from me? I stood, straightening my jacket. I want you to disappear, cut all contact with Emily, find a new job, ideally in another state. If I ever see or hear from you again, I'll give up everything. He nodded weakly, understood. As I walked away, I couldn't help smiling. Everything was falling into place. Henderson and Association Law Office was a monument to old money and discreet dealings. I sat across from Alex, my lawyer and friend, as he went over the divorce papers. You have her dead to rights, Mark, Alex said, looking up from his documents. With this evidence, she has no leg to stand on. I nodded, a sense of satisfaction settling over me. Good. I want this to be over quickly. He sighed and shuffled the papers. All right. I'll file them first thing in the morning. Prepare yourself, Mark. This is going to become ugly. I stood and straightened my tie. I am counting on it. The following few weeks were a blur of legal meetings and court appearances. Emily had hired a shark of a lawyer, but he couldn't do much with the mountains of evidence against her in court. Emily's lawyer made one last desperate move. Your Honor, he said, his voice dripping with fake sincerity. My client admits to her transgression, but Mr. Davis is far from innocent in this case. He had an affair with Mrs. Davis's sister, a clear example of emotional manipulation and cruelty. The judge, a stern-faced woman in her 60s, looked at me over her glasses. Mr. Davis, how would you respond to these allegations? I kept my voice calm and measured. Your Honor, I openly admit my relationship with Chloe. However, this happened after my wife suggested that we open our marriage. I simply accepted her offer. The judge's gaze shifted to Emily. Mrs. Davis, is this true? Have you suggested an open marriage? Emily's face wrinkled. Yes, Your Honor, but I did not mean it. That is enough. The judge cut her off. She turned back to face me. Mr. Davis, while I do not agree with your actions, they do not excuse your wife's infidelity or attempts at financial manipulation. This court rules in favor of Mr. Davis. The gavel landed with a resounding crack as we exited the courtroom. Emily caught up with me, her eyes wild and desperate. Mark, please, she begged, and grabbed my arm. Do not do this. I will do anything. We can start over. Forget that this ever happened. I gently but firmly removed her hand. It is over, Emily. You made your choice, and now you have to live with them. Her face crumpled, and tears streamed down her cheeks. I love you, Mark. Doesn't that count for something? I looked at her. I looked at her for the first time in months. I saw the woman I had loved and who had betrayed me, the woman who had ruined our life together. No, I replied quietly, it does not. I walked away, leaving her sobbing in the corridor. It was finished. The aftermath of the divorce was swift and merciless. I used my connections to spread the word about James's affair with a married woman throughout his professional circles. Within weeks, he was out of work. His reputation was in tatters. Emily wasn't faring much better. Our social circle had largely sided with me, leaving her isolated and alone. I heard through the grapevine that she had tried to reach out to Chloe, but my former sister-in-law wanted nothing to do with her. As for me, I threw myself into my work, climbing the corporate ladder with renewed vigor. The pain of betrayal had hardened me, made me sharper, more focused. I was unstoppable. One evening, as I was leaving the office, I ran into Sarah, Emily's old friend. Mark, she said, her voice hesitant, how are you doing? I gave her a polite smile. I'm doing well, Sarah. And yourself? She shifted uncomfortably. I'm fine. I saw Emily the other day. I raised an eyebrow, waiting. Sarah continued, her words tumbling out. She's not doing well, Mark. She's lost everything. Her job, her friends, her family. She's talking about moving away, starting over somewhere new. I felt a twinge of something, not regret, certainly, but perhaps a sense of finality. I hope she finds what she's looking for, I said neutrally. Sarah looked at me, her eyes searching. Do you ever think about reconciling, forgiving her? I met her gaze steadily. No, Sarah, I do not. She nodded sadly. I understand. Take care of yourself, Mark. As I watched her walk away, I realized that a chapter of my life was truly closing. Emily, James, the life we'd shared, everything was in the past now. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to Chloe's number. We hadn't spoken since the divorce, but I found myself missing her, not as a means of vengeance, but as someone who understood me, saw me at my worst and still cared. My finger was hovering over the call button. Was I prepared for this? I drew a deep breath and pressed call. It rang once, twice. Hello. Chloe's voice was hesitant but warm. Chloe, I replied, feeling something in my chest loosen its grip. I was wondering if you wanted to get coffee sometime to talk. There was a pause, and I wondered if she would refuse. I'd like that, Mark. That is something I would really like. As I hung up, I felt a smile tug on my lips for the first time in a long while. I looked forward to the future. My secretary buzzed me in my office as I was reviewing some contracts. Mr. Davis, your ex-wife is here, she said. She claims it's urgent. I frowned while checking my watch and sent her inside. Emily burst through the door, her face pale and tear-stained. She looked awful, nothing like the polished woman I'd married. Mark, she gasped, collapsing into the chair across from me. I need your help. I leaned back and kept my face neutral. What is wrong, Emily? She took a shaky breath. I am pregnant. For a brief moment, I felt the world tilt, then reality struck back. Congratulations, I replied coldly. I assume James is the father? Emily nodded, fresh tears streaming down her cheeks. Yes, but that isn't why I am here, Mark. He has changed. James has become dangerous. I raised an eyebrow. Dangerous? How? Emily whispered, he's obsessed with revenge. He blames you for everything. His job, his reputation. Our relationship is falling apart. He has been talking about hurting you. I scoffed. James is all talk, Emily. He lacks the courage to do anything. Emily leaned forward, her eyes wide with fear. You do not understand, Mark. He is not the same person anymore. He's unstable. I'm afraid of what he might do. I examined her face for any indications of deception, but couldn't find any. I exhaled. What do you want me to do, Emily? Admittedly, she said, I don't know. I just felt I needed to warn you. Please, take care. I nodded, already devising a plan. Thanks for informing me, Emily. I will take care of it. As she stood there, hesitant for a moment, she added, Mark, I apologize for everything. I met her gaze, my voice harsh. It is too late for that, Emily. As she left, I took out my phone and dialed the number for Detective Johnson. It's Mark Davis, I said. I need to submit a report. After speaking with the police, I called Chloe. Mark, is everything all right? Her voice was warm and concerned. I am fine, I reassured her. But I need you to do something for me. If anything happens, I'll let you know my current location. If you are unable to reach me, please call the police immediately. Can you do that? Of course, Chloe spoke without hesitation. But Mark, what's going on? I briefly explained the situation. I could hear her sharp intake of breath. Be cautious, she urged. Perhaps you could stay with me for a while. I smiled in spite of the tension. I will be fine. All I need is to know that someone is watching out for me. Always, Chloe promised. Over the next few days, I went about my business as usual, but with a renewed sense of awareness. I installed new security systems in my home and office and made an effort to vary my routines, but James was nowhere to be found. The police couldn't find him. He appeared to have vanished into thin air. One evening while driving home from work, I called Chloe. Hello, just checking in, I said as she picked up. Mark, Chloe's voice was warm. How was your day? We talked easily, and the familiarity of her voice helped calm my nerves. Suddenly, I noticed the car following me too closely. Chloe, I said with a tense voice, I think someone is following me. Mark, are you sure? Before I could reply, the car behind me slammed into my bumper. I swore, attempting to maintain control. Mark, what's happening? Chloe's voice was frantic. I opened my mouth to reply, but at that point, my car spun out of control. The last thing I heard was Chloe screaming my name, and then everything went black. I awoke slowly. My head was pounding as my vision cleared. I found myself in what appeared to be an abandoned warehouse. I was tied to a chair, my hands tightly bound behind my back. Well, look who is finally awake. I looked up and saw James standing in front of me, his eyes gleaming with mania. James, I spoke steadily, what do you think you are doing? He laughed, a harsh and bitter sound. What am I doing? I am getting justice for everything you have taken from me. I tested my bonds discreetly. They were tight, but not impossible. I only needed time. I have not taken anything from you, James, I replied calmly. James's face contorted with rage. He stepped forward and back, handing me across the face. Shut up, he screamed. I spat blood and met his gaze defiantly. You ruined your life by sleeping with a married woman. Everything that came after that was a result of your decisions. James paced in front of me, his movements jerky and unexpected. No, you can't blame me. You are the one who pushed Emily away. You are the one who set us up. This is entirely your fault. I carefully observed him. I'm looking for an opening, James. Think about what you are doing. This will not resolve anything. It will only make matters worse. He whirled on me, his eyes wild. Worse? How could things get worse? I have lost everything. Not everything, I replied quietly. You are going to be a father, James. James froze, his face a mask of confusion. What? I nodded slowly. Emily is pregnant with your child. For a moment, James appeared stunned, and then his face hardened. You are lying. Are you trying to trick me? That's the truth, I insisted. Emily told me herself. She is terrified, James, not for herself, but also for your child. James staggered back and sank to his knees. A child. I'm going to become a father. I saw an opportunity while James was distracted. I managed to work with one hand free, feeling around behind me. My fingers brushed against something cold and metallic, a knife. James was still mumbling to himself, lost in his own world. I grabbed the knife and sawed at my remaining bonds, freeing myself. James looked up, his eyes widening when he noticed me standing with the knife in my hand. No, he screamed and lunged at me. We fought fiercely, the knife between us. James was driven by desperation and madness, but I had the advantage of a clear mind and a last burst of strength. I pinned James on the ground, the knife at his throat. It is over, James, I panted. Give up. James glared at me, his eyes filled with hatred. Do it, he spit. Finish it. Prove that you are no better than me. I pressed the knife firmly against his skin, drawing a thin line of blood. It would be so simple. Everything would be over with one quick movement. But then I thought about the child, James's child, Emily's child, an innocent life that did not deserve to be raised without a father, regardless of how flawed that father may be. I slowly pulled the knife away. No, I replied firmly. I am not like you, James. I never was. James's body went limp beneath me, the fight draining from him. What will happen now? He asked, his voice low and defeated. Before I could respond, the warehouse door slammed open. Chloe rushed in, followed by a group of police officers. Mark, Chloe cried and ran to me. Are you okay? I nodded, suddenly exhausted. I am fine. It is over. As the cops took James into custody, I turned to Chloe. How did you find me? She smiled. There were tears in her eyes. The live location application. When I lost contact with you, I immediately called the police. We have been tracking you ever since. I pulled her close and buried my face in her hair. Thank you, I whispered, for everything. The aftermath of James's kidnapping attempt was a whirlwind of police statements and legal action. To everyone's surprise, I chose not to file charges against James. Are you certain about this? Detective Johnson inquired, looking at me skeptically. I nodded firmly, yes. James requires assistance, not punishment, and his child requires a father. As James was taken away for a psychological evaluation, he stopped in front of me. Why? He asked. I met his gaze steadily, because continuing the cycle of vengeance and hatred will accomplish nothing. It's time for everyone to move forward. James nodded slowly, a hint of understanding in his eyes. Thank you, he said quietly before being led away. In the weeks that followed, Emily informed me that James had voluntarily committed himself to a psychiatric facility. He was determined to get better and be a good father to his child. Emily, too, was making adjustments. She had started therapy to work through her issues and prepare for motherhood. One afternoon, she called me. Mark, she said hesitantly, I wanted to thank you for not filing charges against James. For everything, she added. I did not do it for you, I admitted. I did it because it was the right thing to do. Emily was silent for a moment. I understand why you were always the better person, Mark. I apologize for not seeing that before. I sighed and felt a weight lift off my shoulders. Emily, take care of yourself and your child, I promised before hanging up. After the kidnapping, Chloe and I became closer than ever. One evening, we sat on my balcony and watched the sunset. She turned to face me. Mark, she spoke softly, I love you. I believe I always have. I pulled her closer, kissed her deeply, and said, I love you, Chloe, more than I ever imagined possible. She smiled up at me, her eyes bright. What are your thoughts on making this official? Maybe we could start our own family. Her words made me feel a surge of joy. I think that sounds great, I replied. We stood there, arms wrapped around each other, as I reflected on our journey to this point. The pain, the betrayal, the vengeance, it all felt so distant now. I had walked through fire and emerged stronger, wiser, and with a love I had never expected. The future stretched out ahead of us, bright with potential. This was the first time in a long time I was eager to see where it would lead. Here is the next story. Mark Thornton had always taken pride in his ability to read people. As a defense attorney, his career was built on understanding others' motivations and actions, often before they were aware of them. His keen instincts and sharp intellect had earned him a formidable reputation in the courtroom. But these same qualities were now leading him to suspect that something was wrong at home. It began with small, seemingly insignificant changes in Lisa's behavior. She had always been enthusiastic about her volunteer work, devoting her free time to providing legal aid to underserved communities. But lately, her involvement had grown. She worked long hours at the office and frequently returned home late at night, claiming she was swamped with pro bono cases. Mark, who had always supported her work, initially dismissed his concerns. After all, their marriage had been stable for years, founded on mutual respect and shared values. But as the weeks passed, Mark couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong. Lisa had grown distant. Her laughter was less frequent, and her touch more fleeting. Her behavior exhibited new patterns. An increase in emergency meetings, an unfamiliar fragrance lingering on her clothes, and a noticeable guardedness with her phone. Mark's intuition, honed over years of cross-examining witnesses and scrutinizing evidence, told him there was more to the story than Lisa was revealing. Mark decided to investigate one evening while Lisa was attending another late-night meeting. He had never been one to intrude into his wife's personal life, but the nagging doubt had grown too strong to ignore. With a mixture of guilt and determination, he logged into their shared laptop, which they both used for work and personal reasons. He quickly discovered what he was looking for, buried deep in her email history. Mark discovered a series of messages that made his blood run cold. The emails were between Lisa and Judge Henry Wallace, whom Mark had known and respected for years. Wallace was a well-known figure in the legal community, a seasoned judge who presided over some of the most important cases in the city. Mark had frequently appeared before him in court, and while their professional relationship had always been cordial, there was no denying Wallace wielded significant power. The email's content was unambiguous. What began as professional correspondence had evolved into something much more personal. There were hints of flirtation at first, followed by overt displays of affection. Mark read the exchanges with increasing horror. The truth of the situation sank in with each word. The betrayal was not purely personal. It was professional. Wallace had served as a mentor to Mark, a figure whom he admired, and now the man had crossed an unbreakable line. Mark's hands trembled as he scanned the messages, the weight of betrayal pressing down on him. He knew he couldn't confront Lisa about this, not yet. He needed time to process what he had discovered before deciding on his next step. The pain was sharp, like a knife twisting in his gut, and it was accompanied by a cold, calculating anger. This wasn't only about the affair. It was about a breach of trust, personal and professional. Mark knew he couldn't leave it unanswered. As Mark closed the laptop, his mind raced with possibilities. It would be pointless to confront Lisa directly. She'd deny it, make excuses, attempt to rationalize her actions, and Wallace, with his power and influence, could easily dismiss any accusations, exploiting the situation to his advantage. No, Mark had to be smarter than that. He had to think like a lawyer, not a wounded husband. Mark pretended to be asleep that night when Lisa returned home and slipped into bed beside him. He listened to her breathing steadily and calmly, as if nothing had happened, but things had changed. The life they had created together was now a ruse, concealing the lies and deception that lurked beneath the surface. Mark lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing through a maze of emotions and ideas. By morning, he'd made his decision. He would not confront them, not yet. Instead, he would use the tools at his disposal, the skills that had propelled him to the top of the city's legal ranks. He would devise a strategy, a legal trap that would catch both Lisa and Judge Wallace in their own web of deception. And when the time was right, he would pull it off, ensuring that their betrayal resulted in consequences they could never avoid. The prospect of vengeance restored a sense of purpose in Mark's life. He knew it would not be easy. Wallace was a powerful man, and Lisa was equally cunning. But Mark was patient, methodical, and motivated by the desire for justice. He would take his time, carefully assembling each piece of the puzzle, ensuring that when the trap was finally set, neither of them would be able to escape. In the days that followed, Mark began to distance himself from Lisa, but not to the point where she noticed. He buried himself in his work, using it as a cover for the planning that consumed his thoughts. He began gathering information quietly, researching Judge Wallace's recent cases, looking for flaws in the man's perfect public image. He also began paying close attention to Lisa, noting her movements, interactions, and subtle changes in her behavior. The first step in Mark's plan was to locate a case presided over by Judge Henry Wallace, one that would serve as the ideal setting for his revenge. It didn't take long for him to find the perfect candidate, a high-profile corporate litigation case that had received significant media attention. The case involved a large pharmaceutical company accused of concealing the dangerous side effects of one of its best-selling drugs. The stakes were high, and the result could make or break Wallace's career. Mark was aware that the situation was already complicated, with powerful interests on both sides pulling strings behind the scenes. This complexity created an ideal environment for Mark to introduce some chaos. He began by contacting an old acquaintance, Jared Hayes, a rival attorney who held a personal grudge against Judge Wallace. Jared had lost a significant case years before due to one of Wallace's decisions, and he had never forgotten it. Mark knew that Jared's desire for vengeance would make him an eager accomplice. Their meeting was private, held in a quiet corner of a members-only club, away from prying eyes. Jared listened intently as Mark outlined his plan, his expression changing from curiosity to eager anticipation. The plan was simple but brilliant. They would manipulate the evidence in the corporate case to make Judge Wallace appear compromised, as if he had taken bribes or made decisions influenced by improper means. Mark described how they would plant the evidence: a series of forged emails, financial transactions, and phone records that would lead directly to Wallace. The key was to make the evidence plausible enough to warrant an investigation, while not being so obvious that it could easily be dismissed. Jared, whose firm represented one of the opposing parties in the case, would oversee the insertion of the documents into the discovery process, ensuring that they appeared at precisely the right time to raise suspicion. Jared agreed without hesitation to bring down Wallace, and with all the pieces in place, Mark moved on to the next phase of his plan, which involved Lisa. Mark was aware that Lisa had become increasingly reliant on Wallace for more than just their affair. Wallace had been advising her on legal matters and guiding her through the complexities of some of the cases she worked on as a volunteer. Mark decided to use this connection to further trap them both. To ensure the trap was airtight, he began planting false information in Lisa's case file, making subtle changes to documents, providing misleading case notes, and fabricating evidence that suggested she was involved in manipulating court rulings for financial gain. Mark took additional precautions. He used encrypted communication channels to provide anonymous tips to the authorities, implying a conspiracy involving Wallace and Lisa. The tips were vague enough to avoid suspicion, while also being specific enough to warrant an investigation. Mark knew that once the authorities began digging, they would discover the carefully planted evidence, and the web of deception would begin to unravel. Mark observed the situation from a distance over the course of several days. His demeanor was calm and collected at home, and he maintained his facade of normality even as he watched Lisa and Wallace fall deeper into his trap. Lisa continued her late-night meetings and secret phone calls, unaware that Mark was always one step ahead of her. She was so preoccupied with her affair that she overlooked the subtle change in her legal work. Mark's small inconsistencies contributed to her downfall. Meanwhile, the high-profile corporate case took a turn. True to his word, Jared Hayes ensured that the falsified evidence was presented at the most appropriate time. The opposing counsel seized on the discrepancies, questioning Wallace's impartiality and implying that he might be compromised. The media became aware of the controversy, and rumors of corruption began to circulate. The judge, who was previously confident in his position, began to feel the pressure. His decisions in the case were scrutinized, and his integrity was called into question. The investigation gained momentum, and Mark's anonymous tips proved fruitful. Financial auditors began tracking down suspicious transactions, linking them to Wallace in unmistakable ways. Lisa, too, came under unexpected scrutiny. Her pro bono work, once lauded as selfless and noble, became the subject of an investigation. The fabricated evidence that Mark had planted began to surface, casting doubt on her ethics and her relationship with Wallace. It wasn't long before the dots were connected, and authorities began to suspect that the two were conspiring to influence the outcomes of their cases. The tension between Lisa and Wallace grew as the investigations progressed. They began arguing, each accusing the other of being careless and bringing them to the brink of disaster. The affair, which had once been passionate and exciting, had devolved into a toxic partnership, with both of them desperately attempting to protect themselves from the impending scandal. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as the high-profile corporate case approached a critical point. All eyes were on Judge Henry Wallace, who had once earned the respect and admiration of his peers. But now, there was a sense of unease surrounding him. The rumors of corruption, which had previously been whispered in hushed tones, had become louder, and his every move was scrutinized. Wallace, who had taken pride in his impeccable judicial record, now found himself at the center of a scandal that threatened to end his career. Mark watched from the gallery, his expression remaining impassive as Wallace delivered yet another contentious decision. The judge's decisions had become increasingly erratic as a result of mounting pressure and growing concerns about his integrity. Mark knew Wallace was desperately trying to maintain control in order to appear impartial. The seeds of doubt had already been sown. The media had learned of the investigation into Wallace's actions, and reporters were circling like vultures, looking for the next juicy piece of gossip. Headlines speculating on the judge's alleged impropriety began to dominate the news cycle, further tarnishing Wallace's reputation. The whispers that had begun in legal circles had now escalated into full-fledged accusations, with more and more people questioning whether Wallace had been compromised. Mark's plan was unfolding exactly as he had envisioned. The falsified evidence that he and Jared Hayes had introduced into the case had succeeded in casting doubt on Wallace's rulings. Auditors were now dissecting Mark's carefully orchestrated financial transactions, each of which pointed back to Wallace in a way that suggested corruption and bribery. The judge, once untouchable, was now on the defensive, attempting to clear his name. But Wallace wasn't the only one who felt the heat. Lisa, too, was starting to crack under the pressure. The investigation into her pro bono work had intensified, with authorities suspecting her of manipulating court rulings for financial gain. The false evidence planted by Mark in her case files had been discovered, and while Lisa had initially dismissed the discrepancies as minor errors, the pattern was too obvious to ignore. At home, the tension between Mark and Lisa was nearly unbearable. Mark played his role perfectly, expressing concern and support while subtly fanning Lisa's anxiety. She became increasingly paranoid, convinced that someone was targeting her, but unable to prove it. Her once confident demeanor had given way to fear and desperation as she realized her carefully constructed world was crumbling. Lisa and Wallace's relationship deteriorated rapidly as the investigation progressed. What had once been a passionate affair had devolved into a toxic entanglement, with both of them blaming the other for their situation. Their previously exciting secret meetings had devolved into heated arguments, each accusing the other of being the weak link that caused their downfall. Mark, watching from the shadows, took grim pleasure in their misery. He had anticipated how their relationship would deteriorate under the weight of their own guilt and fear. Wallace, once a powerful figure in Lisa's life, had become a liability, someone she feared as much as she desired. The judge, for his part, began to view Lisa as the source of his downfall, a temptress who had led him astray from his once respected career. The breaking point came when a key piece of the falsified evidence was leaked to the press. The document, which suggested that Wallace had accepted bribes in exchange for favorable rulings, was splashed across the front pages of every major newspaper. The media frenzy was immediate and unforgiving, with pundits and legal experts dissecting every aspect of the scandal. Wallace's name was now synonymous with corruption, and his career was effectively over. Lisa, too, was dragged into the public eye. The investigation into her pro bono work uncovered the false evidence that Mark had so carefully planted, and she found herself accused of conspiracy and fraud. The once admired lawyer, who had dedicated her time to helping those in need, was now portrayed as a corrupt opportunist who had used her position for personal gain. As the scandal exploded, Mark watched with a mixture of satisfaction and something he hadn't expected, a faint pang of regret. He had set out to destroy them both, and he had succeeded. Wallace's career was in ruins, and Lisa's reputation was shattered beyond repair. But as he saw the despair in Lisa's eyes and the fear in Wallace's, Mark couldn't help but wonder if the victory was as sweet as he had imagined. The legal community was rocked by the scandal, with colleagues and friends distancing themselves from both Wallace and Lisa. Invitations to social events dried up, and those who had once been close to them suddenly became scarce. They were ostracized by the very people who had once admired them. The storm of scandal had consumed everything in its path. Judge Henry Wallace had been suspended, pending an official investigation. His career was in tatters. The courtroom that had once been his domain was now the scene of his public disgrace, as every decision he had ever made was called into question. Lisa, too, had been suspended from her legal work. Her once promising future was now overshadowed by the looming threat of criminal charges. They were both trapped, caught in a web of lies and deceit that Mark had so carefully woven. Mark Thornton knew that the time had come for the final act. The trap had been set, the pieces had fallen into place, and now it was time to reveal the hand that had orchestrated their downfall. But this revelation would not be made in the courts or the media. It would be personal, a confrontation that would leave no doubt in their minds about who had destroyed them. Mark arranged a meeting with Lisa at a location significant to both of them, the small cafe where they first met. It was a place that had once been filled with warmth and memories, but now it would serve as the backdrop for their final confrontation. Lisa arrived looking tired and defeated, her eyes dark from the weight of the last few weeks. She had not slept well, and the stress of the investigation was visible in every line of her face. She sat down across from him. Mark gave her a small, cold smile. "Thank you for meeting me, Lisa," he said calmly. "I know things have been difficult for you recently." Lisa nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Difficult does not even begin to cover it, Mark. I'm being investigated for crimes I did not commit. My reputation has been ruined, and I don't know who to trust anymore." Mark leaned back in his chair and studied her with detached interest. "Isn't trust a tricky thing? It is so easy to give, however. Betrayal is just as easy. She looked up at him, a look of confusion crossing her face. What exactly are you talking about? Mark's smile widened, but it did not reach his eyes. I am talking about betrayal, Lisa. The kind that cuts more deeply than any knife. The kind that alters everything. For a moment, there was only silence between them. The bustling cafe's noise faded into the background. Mark then reached into his briefcase and pulled out a small stack of documents, which he placed on the table between them. These, he said, tapping the papers with his fingers, are the records of every falsified document, planted piece of evidence, and financial transaction that led to the current scandal involving you and Judge Wallace. Lisa stared at the papers, her face losing color. What do you mean? Mark's eyes were as cold as steel as he leaned in closer, his voice reduced to a whisper. I mean, Lisa, I did it. I set you two up. I planted the evidence, I orchestrated the leaks, and made certain that every move you made would lead you right into the trap I set. Lisa's face was filled with shock and horror. She recoiled as if struck, her eyes wide in disbelief. You did it. Why? Why would you do anything like this? Mark's expression remained unreadable as he observed her reaction. Why? You betrayed me, Lisa. You and that pathetic judge. You thought you could continue your little affair behind my back, humiliating me without repercussions. But you were mistaken. Lisa shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. Mark, I am sorry. I never intended for any of this to happen. I love you. Don't, Mark interrupted, his voice sharp. Don't say that to me. You lost the right to say those words the moment you decided to cheat on me, when you decided that your selfish desires trumped the life we built together. She sobbed and buried her face in her hands, whispering, Thank you, Mark. Please, this cannot be happening. But Mark remained unmoved. He'd seen enough tears in court to know when they were genuine and when they were a desperate attempt to manipulate. It is happening, Lisa, and there is nothing you can do to prevent it. The evidence is overwhelming. You and Wallace are done, both personally and professionally. Lisa looked up at him. Desperation was etched into every feature. What do you want from me? Is this about vengeance? Is this it? Mark's expression softened for the first time, and a shadow of regret passed across his face. At first, I wanted vengeance. I wanted to destroy both of you for what you have done to me. But now I understand that this isn't just about vengeance. It is about justice. You broke the law, Lisa. You and Wallace both. And now you'll have to face the consequences. Lisa's hands trembled as she reached for the papers, which she flipped through with increasing horror. These documents, they will destroy us. Mark nodded slowly. Indeed, they will. And they're only the beginning. The investigation is ongoing, and if the authorities connect all of the dots, you'll be lucky to avoid prison. The cafe felt suffocating, with walls closing in around them as Lisa tried to process the enormity of Mark's actions. Her thoughts raced, searching for a way out. However, there was none. Mark had considered every angle and contingency. She was trapped. Lisa finally met his gaze, speaking in a broken whisper. You have ruined me, Mark. You have ruined everything. Mark's eyes were full of cold finality. No, Lisa, you have ruined yourself. I simply made sure you couldn't get away with it. He stood up and left the papers on the table in front of her. The authorities will be contacting you shortly. I recommend that you cooperate with them. It's your only chance left. Lisa looked up at him, her eyes filled with anger, sorrow, and despair. Was it worthwhile? Mark, was destroying me worth losing everything we had? Mark stopped, his expression unreadable. I'm not sure, he admitted softly. Perhaps it was, perhaps it wasn't. But it's over now. Without another word, Mark turned and walked out of the cafe, leaving Lisa alone with the consequences of her decisions and the wreckage of her life. The trap had been sprung, and there was no going back.